Everybody, welcome back to the Scroll of Thoth. How you doing tonight, gentlemen?
Very good. Excellent. Very good.
All right.
Fantastic.
I am very happy to announce that we have with us tonight the face of YouTube. Oh, we got echo. Hold on. Mr. Billy Brujo of Billy Brujo's Black Magic Cooking Show. Billy, how you doing?
Activity problem, I guess.
Yeah, it just says
I'm here, and I'm alive. You know, in as much as I'm a.
Yeah, this connection is something awful. Why don't we go ahead and start out with, why don't you tell us what the Black Magic Cooking Show is and why you do it?
Well, I used to work in a botanica doing spellcraft, and I kind of got this feeling players' sales tactics were and we were charging rates for what I felt wasn't. I don't know. There's this not accepting money for spiritual thing that I read somewhere, and the point is I would have to turn people away from help because they couldn't afford it. And so I would kind of try to teach those people how to do it for free. And so then, I go back to my paying customers and I'm like, what are you even paying for? So I sort of, there's a DIY channel on YouTube for everything. So why not magic? A lot of YouTube videos on magic are very not to the point. So, I tried to correct that. It's kind of just like, it's like Rule 34. If you can think of something, then porn of that exists on the internet. But there's this little thing called Rule 34B, which is that if you don't find porn, the responsibility falls on you for thinking of it to make it so that Rule 34 stays constant, not just porn. It's like, if you can think of it and it's not out there.
Hey, man, I'm sorry to say this.
But one are also different. 1 and 2.
I'm sorry to say this, but I'm only hearing like every other word. How about you guys?
Yeah, it's cutting out. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely cutting out, unfortunately.
Did you want to reschedule and maybe try
I guess so.
to do this another week with a better internet connection? I still would love to have you on the show and maybe even try to do like a one-on-one interview as a supplement to our regular shows. But I don't know if anyone can even really hear what's going on, unfortunately.
No, probably not. I've been having connection problems lately, so I don't know what it is. Sorry to have lagged down the beginning of your show.
That's all right, man. Hey,
schedule, and I'd be glad to talk about stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely.
Just PM me when you think you could get a good connection, and we'll figure out a time and we'll go ahead and have you back. All right.
All right.
Thanks, man.
All right. Excellent.
No problem.
All right.
Well,
taking the mask off. Well, I guess you could keep taking it off if
pretty
you
fucking
want.
hot.
Yeah, so technical difficulties, I guess, that's part of the internet age. What can you say? Just
Let-
just to say, I liked what he was saying there about how he got into magic. Working at a botanical and having clients that pay for spiritual practice and putting that out there for free. Obviously that goes right in line with our philosophy, our own philosophy here, that like these things need to be done for yourself, and putting that knowledge out there is certainly like a noble kind of task type thing. I thought that was kind of interesting. We look forward to looking maybe to talking with him a little bit more. I did go through some of his stuff. I think it's a really interesting idea, the episode he has that talks about how, like, in caveman times, and the magical weapons, like if you had like a disc to grind stuff on, and a knife to cut, and like a wand, a stick to use as a lever, like to move a rock, and then like a cup to hold water, like to a primitive, the primitive man that didn't have those tools and didn't understand them, like you would appear pretty magical. I did watch that episode. I thought that was a pretty cool idea. One that you pointed out, kind of like an anthropological, introspection into the magical tools, if you will.
Yeah.
I thought that one was pretty brilliant as well. But I think that what he was getting at there in that particular episode, just kind of the archetype of each tool, was actually really fascinating and pretty powerful, because it kind of like pulls from something that's so deeply ingrained, you really don't think about it a whole lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right
Yep.
on, absolutely.
So, did you guys want to go ahead and talk about Cthulhu mythos?
Well, we could talk about whatever. Do we have any questions? Do we have any questions from anybody?
I do not have any questions of anybody as of yet. But hold on, let me take a look and see anything in the live chat. Not right now.
All right. Well, yeah, we could certainly kind of touch on that. We had shuffled around the idea of talking about like the horror and horror or sci-fi influence in magical practice and in the OM practice, and yeah, absolutely. Why don't you start there, James? Give us an idea of kind of where you're coming at.
The Cthulhu mythos stuff, something I've found is that any magician who talks about it, I've heard this story numerous times, in that they hear about it and they're like put off by it. It's like, that's fiction. That's not real. And then they do some magic with the Cthulhu mythos and they're like, holy shit, that's some powerful stuff. And I think especially magicians in the modern age have this kind of idea about what is real and what is not real. And I think that ancient magicians were much more fluid in this, and that stories had power in themselves, and that doesn't disclude it from being a transmission is spiritual, even if it was some guy at a typewriter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's, definitely, a school of thought that like all these Cthulian entities or whatnot, and, the mythos kind of creatures and stuff, are, all came through like, kind of dream states, and which just makes Lovecraft like a prophet, if you will, no different than any of the like biblical kind of stories that you have. It's interesting that you say like when you go back to throwback times, like we're talking about, we go back long enough, you're talking about identical things. Like the Epic of Gilgamesh was like an aspect of the religion in ancient times, and the same thing in Egypt, where you have like these tales of the gods and stuff, like these stories, they were part of the religion. Same like when you have like these Greek stories, and not so much really just aspects of like, oh, there's gods, there's parts where the gods intervene, but even more so like this was really the story of the gods. So like when it kind of like, when does it really become like a separation between the two? Because even when you have modern prophets, you have like Christianity, which still holds true, like all these things that happen in the Bible, these fantastical things that in like physical reality more than likely couldn't have happened like they're said. So yeah, I mean, it goes also a little bit to what we talk about madness, and like are are the crazies the ones that are like getting the transmissions from the other side, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that's usually true. I mean, generally the ones who kind of straddle that line between madness and sanity are the ones that are getting the transmissions, like you said. And I mean, Cthulhu Mythos definitely plays with. I mean, the prime source of gnosis is arguably madness. So,
right.
Definitely a fine line between madness and magic, and something a real magician needs to kind of dance across every once in a while.
Well, we mentioned that we've kind of mentioned that when we're talking about psychedelics and like like pushing the mind kind of that other side where the mind almost snaps and stuff. It's kind of interesting to think about the psychedelic aspects of of Lovecraft. Just I mean, you're talking about things that are so horrible that your mind just snaps. Like it's very kind of it's almost kind of like the other like the bad trip side of psychedelia, and the way that he kind of describes a lot of stuff. I think it's definitely definitely more than anything, it's one of the more fun paradigms to work with. I think it's and I'm not a huge Lovecraft fan particularly. I like his stuff. Obviously, the mythos is fun, but like it's more like pulling stuff out of his stories and playing with them yourself in like a magical context. That's kind of been more fun for me rather than like really being into like him as a literary figure. So I guess in that respect, I almost is kind of looked at him as like, yeah, he is kind of like this. It is kind of almost mystical. The writing themselves, even though it's kind of just it's published originally in pulp dime novels, it almost gives it kind of like a more genuine kind of feel for me. Like it's almost kind of like one of those things that's lost in between the little parts of society that ends up being like the important transmission of thought.
And interesting to note that I've talked about before, author Peter Levenda, who does a lot of conspiracy theory stuff and writes about Cthulhu Mythos, and may or may not be the author of the Simon Necronomicon. He noticed that in the original story, Call of Cthulhu, it starts out with all of these artists and sensitive people going mad after seeing a vision of Cthulhu rising from the sea. And that happens on the same night that there is a Cthulhu ritual that happens in the swamps in Louisiana, which the main character goes and investigates.
Right.
Now he gives dates in the story of when these events happen, and that date that those people were in the swamp are one of the same days. I think it's the first or the second day that Crowley started writing the Book of the Law.
I see what you're getting at. Spooky. Is Call of Cthulhu a equally valid transmission as the Book of the Law?
See, I'm trying to think of what story it was. It was one of the earlier stories he wrote where the Cthulhu mythos started to come into play. But he talked about the entities from whatever the fuck that planet was on the edge of the solar system. Essentially, we would discover them and who they were as soon as they wanted us to, as soon as they sent that thought to our planet. So, if you wanted to build a mythos from that sort of thing, perhaps perhaps that's what was going on by him writing the stories in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, you got the idea of like Azathoth as like the blind mad god at the center of the universe, like is this like a Big Bang kind of concept and stuff, and like you can really, I mean, there's enough there and enough. The interesting and fun thing I think with a lot of the mythos is it's vague enough that you never get the full picture, so you've got like all this kind of space to fill in your own mind, which kind of is what makes it scary and stuff.
Right.
I mean, talk about some of the more interesting topics, I guess, or interesting, I don't know about, but I mean, we could really discuss like how EMK's relation to mythos and kind of how that story comes along. And really, the discovery of the Gutter Bible, which is kind of, finding the Gutter Bible is kind of what kicked off this whole idea of emergence in magic and an emergent magical system, and got us to where we are today. And how that happened, kind of give you the background story. I mean, it's a brief story is in, of course, the Gutter Bible itself that's published. But essentially, what happened was, a group of us were doing heavy Cthulhu mythos stuff, in a group, in an all mythos all the time group for a number of years. And we were doing like kind of all this stuff to open gates and thin the veils between the dimensions, to kind of let all these kind of entities in the mythos through so that we could do magic with them, whatnot. And it was a relatively serious group of magicians, as far as like taking a lot of real time and really doing a lot of magical work with the paradigm, as opposed to just talking about it intellectually. And Sora Panthera, who is our magical partner in OM, made a offering to the ocean, to send out with one of her friends. This offering was like stuff to be thrown into the ocean with the intent that the old ones would make contact with us somehow. And I didn't really know about that. I didn't know about that was done separately, but then it was soon after that we discovered the Gutter Bible. And that was the discovery of the Gutter Bible. It happens early in the morning after we're out for a long time. I kind of look down and I find this journal there, which at the time I always kept my journals in, composition notebooks, like black and white, basic composition notebooks. So look down, I see this composition notebook. We're at a crossroads in Manhattan, kind of in Midtown. On a Sunday early, and saw this notebook and was like, oh, why is my archive here in New York City laying in the gutter? And picked it up and saw it and was like, oh, this is kind of weird. And I threw it back down, and then kind of immediately like picked it back up and was like, oh, this is really weird. This is very kind of strange.
I think there's no question for anyone who has looked at the Gutter Bible for any length of time that the person or persons who wrote it were quite fucking insane.
Yeah, right. Very true. And then the next big step, the first big step was our invocation of Rishwan. And Rishwan came out, like how this ritual worked was we did this invocation of Rishwan. It ended up being like this really scary kind of invocation that Sora Panthera was doing. I expected something kind of more, I don't know, screamy, bitey, kind of like a demon-y type of entity type thing, which is kind of like typical of a lot of our workings and whatnot. And we were going into this so blind, I had no idea really what to expect out of like a journal that you just find in the gutter. But what it ended up being was this kind of very like lost little girl, like very scared, like to the point that it was kind of spooky to me. I was like, oh, this is freaking me out. Should I stop this ritual? Is this too like?
Hold on, let's just rewind for a second. So this ritual that you're talking about,
yeah,
I'm assuming went pretty much like most Gutter Bible rituals, in that you found a passage in the Gutter Bible, you used it as some kind of chant or sigil. Is that correct?
We found a line in there that says there is a mad woman named Rishwan, and that's what we worked from. There's a mad woman named Rishwan, and then we're like, okay, well, there's this mad woman named Rishwan, let's invoke her. And she ended up being like this scared, lost girl caught between the spaces, and was saying things like, I'm being chased by a monster and I'm like stuck between the spaces. And all this is this is all very Lovecraft. And I mean, we were doing it in a Lovecraft kind of context when we started this, because the Gutter Bible itself wasn't a paradigm yet. It was just a book. So it's not, we didn't take the Gutter Bible and grab, 777 and start adding stuff up and figuring out the thelemic values of what was in the Gutter Bible. What we did was we took it the way of the mythos, because that's what we were doing at the time. So I guess that's how I'm saying it relates. We didn't bust out the Golden Dawn book or Dee's Enochian books and try and figure out like what Enochian spheres were represented by the Gutter Bible. We didn't try and figure out if there were sigils in there that looked like Veves or were represented Loa in Santeria or something. Could have disconstructed it any kind of different way. We just ended up using the mythos because that's what we were working with at the time. And that kind of influenced the next part of it, because once we realized, once we ended the ritual and we realized kind of what the essence of this entity was, kind of the storyline of this lost, scared little girl in between the spaces. It's being kind of chased. Our original discussions were like this empathetic discussion, like, oh, we should like help this entity and like give them maybe seals or make sigils to give them to like help and blah blah blah. But then it was like after like a couple days of like, dreams and like just like generally meditating on the whole process of it, it was like started to occur to me, but that given the fact that it was a Lovecraft paradigm, it was like it was too simple. It was like too easy. And that's when the conceptualization of the anglerfish, that's where it came from. It was like getting pushed in the direction of Lovecraftian storyline stuff, where like you would empathize with this little girl and then like give up your magical protection, essentially step outside of the circle, if you will, to help them. But what happens every time when you do that is then there's like some monster behind that, like waiting to devour you, like an anglerfish. Like Rashwan became like the light at the end of, like the lure of the anglerfish, like this thing that you're drawn to as a human being. And then behind that is this larger monster that's waiting to kind of devour you. And this all becomes more symbolic because after that kind of initial push, then it becomes a little bit more EMK. Then, we're not really, there was parts where we would definitely invoke like Yog-Sothoth as a gate and use some other, like there was a Cthulhu, kind of a Cthulhu lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, if you will, that we'd do like different parts. We had the different parts of the Necronomicon we'd read at different corners. And so initially when we were doing these first few things, we used some of that leftover stuff kind of that was from the Cthulhu magic days when we were working with that. And that kind of blended out as it started to develop itself. So that, we weren't using like Yog-Sothoth or Cthulhu or any of those kind of ideas. Once we got past like the initial part and started like figuring out the different aspects of Ungloff. Now, also, the other vine to that is, of course, Mama Eowek. And Mama Eowek is the first, is what I call a dual emergence of me and Soror Panthera. That's kind of like we talk a lot about like when you get the Gutter Bible and you go into it and you pull out like your own personal kind of thing, each different individual person, and then we have this kind of group thing that we work with, and that's kind of how it works. So that's what I call a dual emergence, when you take something out and then you develop it to a certain point that's developed within yourself. And so our kind of thing is the legend of Mama Eowek, which is essentially the mythos version of Babylon. So the story with Eowek is Cthulhu is like sunken and he has this like his main like avatar or whatever, his main like person, and he sends her up to the small island, and she comes out of the ocean like very beautiful and like covered in gold, and then she like enslaves and eats all the people of the island and forces them to build these like star structures, these like star studying weird sculpture things to study the stars so that she can like let Cthulhu loose. And that's the basic loose story of the background of like a short story of what Mama Eowek is. But ritually, Mama Eowek is essentially, she's the goddess of sex and wealth in the mythos. She's kind of like the Babylon of mythos, because mythos didn't really, and I mean this comes, I mean it's quite obvious if you know us. I mean this kind of comes, this is a dual emergence because it's so much colored by who we are as magicians. Like that they're people talk about like Shub-Niggurath, and like people talk a lot about the sexual aspects of Lovecraft's work, and it really isn't there. He's very asexual.
That's what I was about to say. This is something that Lovecraft himself would have never
been horrified by. He would have been absolutely horrified by. Like a Mama Eowek represents kind of everything that he feared, like female, like this shapeshifter that is like has all and a powerful sexual being, which
there's Shub-Niggurath, but it's really not the same thing.
Exactly. And everybody says that. Oh, Shub-Niggurath, like the goat with 10,000 young, that's sexual. Well, that really isn't. So, but I mean, it's very much like EMKs is this blending of the psyche of the magician and like what so the idea that Soror Panthera and I would come up with like a sex goddess type entity with our workings is not too much of a surprise. And so anyways, that's really the surviving like direct link. That's the only way where the only place where you're going to, read in Emergent Magic, you're going to read about Cthulhu specifically like that, because there's a link there. And it's almost just like a nod and a throwback, very much in the philosophy sections of, the stuff that we publish. There's, you're going to mention chaos magic in the story, paradigm parts of, our book. You would have mention of Cthulhu there. So that's some of the relations, I guess, that we have, as far as the Gutter Bible, how that relates to mythos specifically.
So, David, you've done some Cthulhu stuff before, haven't you?
Yeah.
What were some of your takeaways from Cthulhu rituals? What were some of the things that seemed to really influence you?
Wisdom out of madness, essentially like pushing madness to, we've already kind of covered that, honestly. Kind of pushing madness to that edge where you basically think that you've lost it all, only to kind of have a blissful sort of wisdom and rebuilding of your, or I should say perhaps mistaking something that seems horrible and nightmarishly horrific, like losing your mind, or I should say mistaking enlightenment for something more horrific, you know what I mean? Or thinking that I think that's a little difficult for me to elaborate upon, perhaps, but essentially, kind of thinking that this paradigm holds something more horrific and monstrous, but in the end, kind of having it being all roses and pretty lights.
To me, one of the things, the mythos themselves were probably some of the first postmodern fiction to be written. So you got that postmodernism link, in that mankind is not the center of the universe, which is a frightening thought, especially when we've had, so many cultures, and for thousands of years, we always saw ourselves as the hero in the story, the center of the universe. Things happen because of human beings. And the Cthulhu mythos were totally not that. We are kind of ants out there. And I think it gives a good perspective to approaching spirits in EMK, to approaching the gods of EMK, and to remember that it's quite possible that they don't give a fuck about you.
Yeah, another, to kind of go down the road a little bit in the story narrative and get to some of the other sci-fi and horror aspects of EMK, which, besides Cthulhu, so I think we've covered a little bit on Cthulhu mythos stuff. So, really, once we kind of came up with the Mungloff part of the paradigm, which again, like anybody that, hasn't kind of read some of this stuff, Mungloff is essentially our god of magic. Mungloff is our god of magic, EMK, and that name came from all these different series of rituals, and Mungloff has this lure, which is, Rishwan, who's kind of the gatekeeper. Now, once we got this central part of that paradigm, the next part was, to kind of see like what other, like essentially this is the way I described it. Like if there's a bar, right, in, one of H.P. Lovecraft's alternate dimensions, and there are different old ones, different entities, hanging out at this bar, and Mungloff is one of these, gods of magic, because there's all like Mungloff is like the god of magic to like us on Earth that we understand on this dimension, but like he, if he's an old one, by, essentially, through kind of this Lovecraft, reasoning, if you will, or just the idea of just like weird alien monsters as a paradigm in general, or if you look at, any kind of paradigm, Enochian, there's other angels, the low, there's different entities in voodoo, and there's other gods that are like friends and stuff. Pretty much, even in Christianity, there's all these other different spirits. So like, once we did all this work to figure out who Mungloff is and have contact with him, like who are the other people if we like can go into that like old ones only bar, like 18th dimension, must be 21 trillion years old to enter. Who are the other people that Mungloth hangs out with? Like, who are the other people in this nightclub of mythos? Like, what are these? Who are his friends? Who are his allies, if you will, or the other people the other names of these other entities that we can kind of expand the paradigm beyond that? Because we kind of had this like central big working and it was done. And so that's where Tazaki and Kaaye come from. Tazaki and Kaaye being two aspects, static and kinetic death, one being, like the movement and stuff, like the idea of, movement, the other being more like a black hole, like void thing, one concept being like death, because you have this life first and then you have death, and the other just being like the center of a black hole where like there is no life and it's just like almost death. And it's just kind of weird ways that we've come up with to conceptualize with these two entities. And the idea of the grid of spirits was that all of our invocations showed that they didn't like to be invoked in the same space. There was a tension between them, and the original idea of that tension kind of ripping a hole in the fabric of the universe and creating a grid of smaller spirits in between was really kind of brought home when I was explaining it, probably in the first stages of explaining how it worked, by one of our good friends in the Satanic Temple. And what she said was, so it's like, she made the observation, it's like the grid, like the Leviathan grid in Hellraiser 2 specifically, where you have this kind of geometric shape that's rising up, and that itself is like their god is like a tetrahedron essentially. And I really liked that idea and latched onto that a lot, because that was like that was exactly kind of what I was shooting for. And then that's what led me into like really understanding how the gates work in the way that the dimensional portal works in Phantasm. And Phantasm, anybody that hasn't seen it, it's a movie about like aliens that come through dimensional portal to steal dead bodies. And this dimensional portal works like a tuning fork. And I always remember that, like as a kid, like how they figure it out. And it's like two poles, and they have a vibration between the two of them. And the vibration between the two of them opens the gate into the next dimension. So that's where this book 2 like stuff kind of comes from. It comes from these horror movies, like sci-fi movies. And I think a lot of where we're going with starting out with talking with Lovecraft, at least with this talk today, is like how this stuff can influence us, how this fictional stuff can be as much of an influence to our magical working as our spiritual progression as like ancient biblical or Buddhist or tantric texts, or so-called bona fide religious materials, because it's essentially working on the same thing when we're talking about magic being consciousness. And in a lot of cases, I think, these modern things, people identify with it more. We talk a lot about Babylon, and, Babylon takes place at Camp Midian. And of course, like Midian being a reference to Nightbreed, which is another, Clive Barker,
Midian's where the monsters go.
Right, and they worship Baphomet, and it's under the earth, and like that's hugely influential. That now there's
well, let me ask you a question. Then. Why do you think EMK is so heavily influenced by horror and not other forms of modern stories?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, like for me personally, there's something specifically about working with the Gutter Bible that feels very untamed and very spooky. Not necessarily because it is specifically dark per se, but because it is unknown, because you don't know what's going to come through, because as a magician there's always that worry in the back of your mind when you invoke something like, oh no, is this the time that I'm going to be possessed forever and just go fucking batty? And that's the kind of fear that fear I guess feels more real when working with things that are largely unknown like that you get from the Gutter Bible and from EMK. So that, I think, is why I find it a little bit spooky and horror filled, or why it would be inspired by horror films, because horror films often pull from that which is unknown or monstrous. So.
Or as Lovecraft said, the oldest and greatest fear is that of the unknown.
Yeah.
Jason, what are your thoughts on that?
Right, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think just to add to that a little bit, I mean, the Gutter Bible itself looks like it's from a horror movie or a slasher flick. Something involving a serial killer or somebody that's seriously unhinged. And this is a really another thing that comes up a lot in direct reference to it physically and to the book itself is people like bring that up often, that it looks like all these movies where there's always a part in the movie where they find the deranged killer's notebook, or like they find and it always looks extremely, it always looks contrived, it always looks like a really good art degree holding intern spent a fucking month making it as crazy as possible, and it's all perfectly balanced crazy, and there's blood here and all this stuff, and every time you look at it you kind of get this feeling like it's a movie prop. But when you look at the Gutter Bible, it reminds you of all that shit, and you're like, God, that shit looks so fake compared to this. I can tell this is seriously some fucked up weird shit.
Oh yeah.
And that's kind of I've always found that kind of cool. I like the genuineness of that. I think another concept too. We talk a lot in EMK about different dimensions, different planes of existence, stuff like that, and a lot of modern horror kind of plays into a lot of kind of these ideas. And you look at the Nightmare on Elm Street, the idea of Nightmare on Elm Street, that your dreams can come and get you, essentially, physically come and get you, and that there's a real a physical crossover between those two dimensions. And there's a lot in horror and sci-fi that deals with that deals with different types of dimensional stuff, and the idea of places out of time, and all these things are kind of themes that we play around with a lot. But yeah, I definitely think that it's just kind of spooky stuff. I mean, it's Gutter Bible isn't going to be it doesn't kind of, I just feel it doesn't really lend itself to a lot of these other kind of other paradigms that are out there as much as it does to the kind of pulp horror that we've kind of framed around it a little bit.
For you guys, so what goes into a good Cthulhu or horror or Gutter Bible ritual? What are the things that you think should definitely be done in rituals like that? Maybe not all the time, but should be a part of those themes.
Well, I mean, like Zai had mentioned earlier, it's obviously really important, and what we're getting at with it, the core of it is the idea of the unknown, and to push the boundaries into places that you don't know where it's going to go. And it's important to develop that and have these dual emergences that you do that, but it's important to I guess I'd say that there's always something new, that you're always it doesn't become redundant, that there's certain things that you work on and then you got to refine it, that there should always be this kind of next aspect. And even if it's not something that ends up getting built on a lot, it's always good to just kind of go in at a weird way and see. And something, I mean, we've experienced before, it might seem to not be super effective at the time, but then a couple weeks later you can have this intense dream that connects it all for you and makes it this really valid thing, or you might have this revelation later on. So I think experimentation is the key to it. That's the important part. There's never a time where it's going to be Gutter Bible is going to have EMK or OM is going to have the monthly thing, it's time for the Feast of Mungloth 12, or it's time for Rashwan's the washing of Rashwan festival on the third moon, and even though there might be one or two kind of key dates that you might want to remember and stuff, there's always that experimentation part that is really important, I'd say. What do you think? What do you think, James?
I think that developing fear in these rituals is important. Kind of making sure that perceptions are altered and that sort of thing. And I also want to say, and something you already kind of touched is the thing that's different from EMK and other pop culture magic stuff is that rule, that EMK is the slow magic, the long invocation. And I so often see people who want to do pop culture magic that they'll go and they'll, fit whatever pop culture thing they have, like My Little Ponies or Game of Thrones or whatever, they're into. And then they take the characters and they kind of fill them into certain roles in magic and then basically do, pre-standard magical rituals just with insert this name here.
Sure.
And
right.
And then they do it once and then they're done. Hey, wasn't that great? No, that wasn't fucking great. There's no depth.
Well, it might have been fucking great, you know what I mean? But I see where you're going with it.
Yeah,
well, Yeah, I get you. I think maybe maybe in a lot what we're just talking about like just techniques of maybe we're just talking about like techniques like chaos magic and eclectic magic and Discordian magic, if you will, in general. Like as we talked about before, like there can be tendencies with some practitioners to like, oh, I'm gonna do this for I'm just gonna do this time and then move on really quickly, and as where we stick with stuff it's maybe a little bit different. And yeah, I'd say that's true, but I mean at the same time, like a good application, I think you can really get into a little bit deeper stuff, like the Twin Peaks stuff. That's another. If you want to talk about pop culture paradigm stuff and fiction, Twin Peaks is hugely influential to me. That's probably, that's basically Twin Peaks is how I cut my teeth on how to build a real paradigm for groups in group magic, because that was my main project when I joined my first large magical group, which was the IoT. And I spent a ton of time, in that little world, and I'm pretty fucking excited about the new season in I think about 20 days or so now.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have to do a podcast about that.
But yeah, we can do a whole thing with that. Certainly I was highly influenced by that. But yeah, in there, you've got the key to the Black Lodge being fear itself, and having to, drag somebody out and scare them so much in the woods that the gate opens up, and that's kind of, I always really kind of like that. And, that's pure Lovecraft. Like, and you already made the quote, it's like, the oldest and strongest emotion of man is fear, and the, worst fear is that of the unknown or whatever. Yeah, that's totally what that's just Lynch is using that same kind of idea and throwing it in Twin Peaks in kind of really weird kind of postmodern way. We could certainly talk about Twin Peaks, being the dawn of postmodern television, and its influence. But again, that's probably I don't know if Twin Peaks really. I think it probably fits in between horror and sci-fi, and it's just. Into just kind of its own little dimension,
into its own weirdness. I loves me some Twin Peaks. You know that.
Who doesn't?
And I've done Twin Peaks rituals. You know that as well.
Right, yeah.
But as far as when I'm really looking for true illumination, I don't know if I actually turn to like, let's do a Twin Peaks ritual.
Yeah, I don't think that you can take that and make. That's not going to be EMK. You're not going to get to like. You might get aspects of emergence with that, like as we talked about before, but like, yeah, because that paradigm is so kind of a set thing. Like, I think you would be you would be hard pressed to like move like for the rest of your life into that paradigm or whatnot. You kind of, it's almost like, you do it like there's kind of little aspects that I'll always like bring back to. It's kind of like one of those things. And we've talked about that before, how there are different things that you're into. There's different projects that you work on. And again, like we talk about group magic, like that was very much like that. That's a group inspired type of thing, because the Twin Peaks magic stuff is like, this is a fun thing. Like if everybody knows the paradigm together, it binds people because everybody's watching the same story. It's only 2 seasons, so there's not a ton of material there. You can go through it rather quickly, and then it's like everybody's kind of in on the same joke. So that's what makes Twin Peaks so perfect for like group type magic. And I think that's probably true with some of the Cthulhu stuff too, because you're working with kind of these out of control crazy entities, like as a Thoth, that's something that you're generally not going to like invoke that kind of thing by yourself. That's not really the kind of like, it's like, oh, what are you going to do tonight? Oh, invoke Yog-Sothoth by myself. That's like, it might be great and all, but it's not going to be like, if you've got 4 or 5 people, then you can really invoke Yog-Sothoth. So I think, as this stuff, as we're talking about, reason we're talking about any of these subjects is how do they relate to EMK, and how is that relevant to OM and our practice, what we're talking about with emergent magic.
I think you touched on it a couple minutes back when you said that these things, while you might not do it all the time and it might not be your main focus, they are great ways to develop group unity.
Right.
To just go out and do a fun. Sometimes you do rituals for fun, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Mostly.
I mean,
mostly entertain myself. I mean, whether it's for illumination or for fun or mostly I'm entertaining myself. We've already established, though, the magic is a pursuit of the privileged, essentially. So
yeah, of course. It's we're all still definitely having fun, and then like in between the spaces of all these like hard times are these like these sliver moments of extreme clarity.
Right. Soul. But to say that that's not entertaining is that would be.
Well, yeah, it's not true. it needs to as well be entertaining. Well, I mean, there we go. I mean, how does EMK relate to the sci-fi and horror and pulp, industry? Is that, well, it requires it to be entertaining. Like it needs to have like the cool aspects to it. Like it needs to be fancied up nicely. Like, and we don't want it fancied up like Discordianism. We want it fancied up like fucking Hellraiser.
A lot of people try to tell you that necromancy is the oldest form of magic, that ancestor worship is the oldest religion, and that could be true, but perhaps the oldest form of magic itself is storytelling.
Sure.
I mean, if you can evoke emotion just by the words that are coming out of your mouth.
I think again, kind of what I mean. You're nailing home some real good issue there, buddy, with that one. I like that. And I think it goes to something that I was saying a little bit earlier, more about how that is intertwined. And like, you are probably right. Like, it was the shaman, not also the storyteller. And then, like, I think in most cases, yes, of course he was. That probably was, that's probably 90% of, what the shaman would do, tell the stories at night, which is probably every night, the stories of the gods, the tales of the, warriors, tales of the ancestors that were trying, and like knowing those tales, knowing these stories would be passed down from, generation to generation. But I think in probably community too, there would be more storytellers, but certainly like the spiritual leaders would be to the forefront of the people that was doing that. And then later on, of course, it was only the spiritual and religious that could write. Originally the only people that could write anything was priests, high priests of different places, and architects, extremely skilled architects and people like that. But mostly, and especially in the Dark Ages, it was the church that was literate. So, all the stuff that you're kind of getting out there is coming, all the stories are coming from spiritual people, kind of. But I definitely think that that's true. That the idea that you know, especially in the way that we're talking about magic being an altering of consciousness, you know, watching a scary movie of gives a certain, have a certain reaction within yourself, or experiencing as like a sci-fi film that has like concepts of time that are strange, and you take these things and make them kind of become part of your consciousness. And these different modern ways of storytelling, is kind of like why it is EMK. Why is it EMK and not like all these other things? Well, like because we have movies, and we have YouTube, like we talked about earlier. We have all these different, and we talk a lot about why is this now, and it's because this really goes to it, because this is at a time where for the first time in history, like some horror and sci-fi films might be more relevant spiritually to people than the Bible and other spiritual tomes to a lot of people.
Well, here's a question for both of you that you guys can answer in turn. Do you believe that storytellers have the capability of creating something outside themselves that truly exists?
Well, yeah. I mean, they definitely evoke emotion into another person. They evoke thoughts and feelings. And I mean, like, if you just look at our own cultural narrative right now, if you just take the Bible and preachers as storytellers, sort of modern storytellers, I mean, they evoke emotions and feelings into people that have very real and tangible effects on our reality, concerning the pushing of legislation and the oppression of certain individuals. So if that's not fucking real, I don't know what is,
Yeah, well, I guess you make a real good point. Of kind of like we could touch on the dangers of of stories, and understanding the difference between this is a sci-fi horror story, and I might like this concept, and I might be able to even relate it to a spiritual aspect of my life, as opposed to like I believe this story that the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
Right.
And these are dangerous things, and certainly stuff we've
on the flip side of that, can a storyteller evoke other feelings in you? I mean, like, when I was much younger and experimenting with a lot of psychedelics, I read Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, and that inspired me to take a magical path. That was one of many things that kind of came across my plate at the time. But I mean, that there's a story that I took as a story, and I wasn't gonna act on as if it was real, and yet it seemed to allude to something deeper, and so it had a tangible effect in my own personal life. So,
well, Grant Morrison says that entire series was just a giant sigil,
right,
and it affected his life greatly.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I personally would take it a step further and say that these entities do exist, and they can affect the physical world, not always, but sometimes. And it's kind of one of the ways, because I don't want to say everything is human centric, but one of the ways that spirits are created. Chaos magic has servitors, egregores, sorry, and
Sure.
These things are very real. And I don't see why a writer, because I am a writer, and I know what kind of gnosis goes into writing, to tearing that shit out of your brain and putting it into words, creates.
Right. Okay, well, yeah, and to get to a different vein of sci-fi and not so horror related, I mean, look at Star Wars franchise and the Jedi religion, essentially. I mean, you've got such a massive, rabid fan base of that storyline and of that paradigm, and you'd have like people that are like legitimately setting up Jedi temples as like their full-time like a religious practice. I think it's like a legal religion in like 3 different countries or something now. Like you can just legitimately be a Jedi, and you can keep their shit. And
I am a Jedi.
And that's straight up. And that's, I mean, it's almost like, I guess, in some aspects, it's almost like role playing taking to the extreme. But for people, that is out there. That is something that's like, folded over. Where that these are the things that are in modern times that you see that people like are taking such inspiration from film and like these storylines, these fictional storylines, that, you know, that's becoming more important. That's where they're going for their spirituality and for their building of their tribe. That's who they're interacting with, other people with those same interests. They're not going, you know, to the synagogue. They're not going to the Buddhist temple. They're not going to church. They're going to like whatever their Jedi temple space that they all rented together downtown is. And that's pretty fucking cool. I like that. And you know, that kind of stuff is kind of inspiring towards, you know, the idea of EMK, that you can kind of go out, you know, it's, you know, magic is your own consciousness. You pick your kind of paradigm thing. I wouldn't so much as go to say that like, oh, you know, these Jedis are practicing emergence. I don't know. Maybe you might get one truly becomes a Jedi.
No, really, I was about to ask you. So, how does EMK compete in a world full of fucking Jedis?
Well, I mean, again, a spookier clientele.
Well,
okay, so we're not.
I would say, and Star Wars does fit this bill to an extent, but anything that touches upon stories that touch upon Jungian archetypes, stories that touch upon models of mythology, like, you know, Joseph Campbell talks a lot about Star Wars, are generally the ones that produce this kind of effect, that produces people who will make it into a religion or make it a part of their practice, who really internalize it. And I think that EMK, that the Gutter Bible, has that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to argue with you there, buddy. Everybody should run out and buy one. So,
David, do you have your own copy of the Gutter Bible?
No. Jason was supposed to give me one in exchange for 6 sets of acid. I never got one.
He keeps forgetting it. It's, you know, it's in the mail.
Word diggity.
The Gutter Bible in David is in his heart.
It's in my soul.
You know what? I think that's a good place to end this this podcast. Yeah, you guys have anything else that you want to add?
No. I just I think it was a nice little. I think we hit on some different interesting topics tonight on just you know, horror and fiction and how it relates to EMK. And yeah, I enjoyed talking with you guys. It was good. We'll come up with a topic for next time. I'm looking forward to it.
I just want to say I really like that Pegasus in the background there.
Oh yeah, I've got a date later.
He's the devil. And I would like to say I'm sorry that things didn't work out with Billy Brujo, but we'll definitely have him back.
Yeah.
And,
check out his stuff online. He does have some cool stuff. Like his videos are both informative and also, you know, relatively humorous. But you know, everything that I've watched, like, I mean, he's giving legitimate information and he's doing it in a serious way that people can use it. And he's going over a very large variety of different techniques. So people are new to magic and are looking for a place to, like, you know, kind of check new stuff out. Definitely check out his videos. He seems like, you know, I'm interested to talk to him more, but he's definitely got some good ideas. There's some good information that's getting put out there. You know, another thing too, I want to touch real quick on, James, that you mentioned, is people that were asking about books to read and asking about, you know, where to get what direction to get pointed in. You know, obviously our Emergent Magic book isn't done yet. And I thought about that, and I really want to make a pretty strong plug myself. If you're looking for what to read to get a good background on magic, modern magic, get Modern Magic by Donald Michael Craig, because that book is pretty much like gonna be a primer. That's like Chaos in the Modern Age 101, and the most recent updated version of Modern Magic that he put out just like a year or two before he passed away, has an updated section on chaos magic. So he went through as the years went on, and it's been as the book was out for a while, and he really added new stuff and made a real effort to update it. But there's everything, every main paradigm, every kind, all the stuff that we touch on loosely in our conversations. You know, if we're throwing words around or referencing people or different, you know, magical movements that, you know, people aren't familiar with, that we might not get back to. And I know James is really good about being like, oh, well, you know, here's this, because not everybody knows. Like, it's all in there. It's all in there. If you read Modern Magic, you're going to have a basic background of all the different, you know, streams, if you will, that lead to the river, you know, of EMK. So anyways, yeah, that's a good place to start if people are wondering what book to get out there, and it's readily available.
I will second that. And on that note,
right.
Good night, gentlemen, and
Good
you
night.
have an excellent night.
Cool.
See ya.